3 hours Universal Time. Stay tuned for Daybreak Africa coming up after these latest world news headlines.
I'm Dave DeForest reporting. Trump gains opposition. Republican U.S. presidential frontrunner Donald Trump is drawing rebukes from across the world for proposing a total ban on Muslims entering the United States. Trump said the ban should be in effect until the country's leaders can, in his words, figure out what's going on about possible new terrorist attacks. Here is White House spokesman Josh Earnest.
The question now is about the rest of the Republican Party and whether or not they're going to be dragged into the dustbin of history with them. And right now, the current trajectory is not very good.
However, Trump's political opponents widely condemned his proposal. Legal experts say a ban on Muslims entering the country would be unconstitutional. Investigators looking into last week's California massacre believe the husband and wife shooters may have been preparing their mass murder for as long as a year. They say the two practiced at several gun ranges, and they suspect the couple took out a $28,500 bank loan, knowing they would never pay it back. There are still no signs that U.S.-born Syed Rizan Farouk and his Pakistani wife were part of a terrorist cell or group. The U.S. House of Representatives has overwhelmingly voted to bar people who have visited Iraq and Syria in the past 5 years from the program that allows visa-free entry into the U.S. People from 38 countries must obtain a visa to travel to the U.S. The bill was passed 407 to 19 Tuesday. A South African judge has granted bail to Oscar Pistorius. The Olympic athlete appeared in court Tuesday to hear whether he could remain under house arrest while awaiting new sentencing. An appeals court last week convicted him of murder in the 2013 shooting death of his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp. This is VOA News. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says he is hopeful that talks will be held next week on ending the war in Syria. Speaking after a meeting with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in Paris, Kerry said the talks, scheduled for December 18th in New York, will depend on events in the coming week, including a Saudi-led conference of the Syrian opposition. Russia says it has for the first time struck Islamic State targets in northern Syria with missiles fired from a submarine in the Mediterranean. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu told President Vladimir Putin the cruise missiles targeted two positions near the Islamic State-controlled city of Raqqa. The United States is reviewing reports that Iran carried out a ballistic missile test last month in violation of a UN Security Council resolution. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power said Tuesday the United States is conducting a serious review of the reports.
If we can confirm it, and if there is a violation of any UN Security Council resolution, we will come here and we will seek appropriate action. U.S.
officials say the test was conducted on November 21st and that the missile traveled within Iranian territory. The leader of the semi-autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan region government is to visit Ankara on Wednesday. Dorian Jones takes a look.
In what is widely seen as a sign of the importance Ankara attaches to Iraqi Kurdistan regional president Masoud Barzani, he's due to be hosted Wednesday by the president Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Barzani's visit coincides with Baghdad demanding Ankara's withdrawal of recently deployed Turkish soldiers and tanks in Iraq. The former head of Turkey's consul to the Iraqi Kurdistan region, Aydin Selchen, says the visit is further evidence of Barzani's support of Ankara against Baghdad. Dorian Jones, Istanbul.
5 Taliban gunmen are holding a number of civilians hostage as they fight Afghan security forces at a military housing block near the Kandahar airport. Earlier Tuesday, Taliban suicide bombers attacked the complex, killing 18 people. 9 of the suicide bombers were killed. 5 others seized the hostages. Democrats in both the U.S. House and Senate used procedural tactics Tuesday to try to get Republican leaders to take up gun control legislation. The failed legislation would have prevented any person on the FBI's so-called no-fly list from buying a gun. The proposal was said to be in response to recent mass killings in the United States. Republicans opposed the legislation, saying some innocent people would end up on the list, and no one can find out if they are on the list in the first place. In Washington, I'm Dave DeForest.
That's the latest world news from VOA.
Good morning, Africa. Welcome to Daybreak Africa from the Voice of America. I'm James Barte in Washington. Today's Wednesday, December 9th, and here are some of the stories we are covering. The dates for a constitutional referendum to allow President Paul Kagame to stay in power have been announced.
Referendum, the dates are 17th December for people who are voting from the diaspora, and then December 18th for Rwandans who live in Rwanda.
Kennedy Undahiro is the executive editor of the Daily New Times newspaper of Rwanda. Protesters denounced Nigeria's new social media bill as unconstitutional. Boko Haram attacks lead to food insecurity in parts of Chad, and Burundi and the European Union have held consultations over the country's continuing human rights and political crisis.
They say that they noticed that what is going on does not conform to the agreement of Cotonou, that there are many topics that are in the agreement of Cotonou that are not respected by the Burundian government.
Innocent Muhozi is the general manager of the banned Independent Renaissance Radio and Television Network of Burundi. India seeks to increase generic drug exports to Africa, and the World Health Organization calls for a public health agenda at the Climate Change Conference in Paris. Those stories plus Mark Oldman Sports and our listener of the day are coming up on Daybreak Africa. Rwanda's cabinet, under the chairmanship of President Paul Kagame, on Tuesday gave its stamp of approval for a constitutional referendum that would allow Mr. Kagame to run for a third term. The voting dates are December 17 for the diaspora and December 18 for those inside Rwanda. Kagame, 58, has ruled Rwanda since his army ended the 1994 genocide and ousted Hutu extremists from power. The United States has said it expects President Kagame to step down at the end of his current term in 2017. Kennedy Undahiro is executive editor of the Daily New Times newspaper of Rwanda. He says the referendum is expected to be approved since the parliament has said it received petitions from more than 3.6 million eligible Rwandan voters to change the constitution.
Once someone petitions the government that they want to change the constitution, it goes through parliament. Then from parliament it goes to Senate. So it has passed through all those stages. So the stage that was remaining was being put in front of the cabinet. So the cabinet now has to ask the president that he should sign either a presidential decree or order so that to set the date for the referendum. So referendum, the dates are 17th December for people who are voting from the diaspora, and then December 18th for Rwandans who live in Rwanda.
The Elections Commission is going to be conducting the referendum. Are they prepared? Have they announced anything in terms of how it's going to be done?
It is something very simple because there's not much preparation needed to carry out a referendum because all the materials are usually stocked within the Electoral Commission. And Rwanda is so small, the territory is so small that, taking the ballot boxes and papers, it does not take a lot of logistical and then to be a yes or no vote. So there's no need to campaign. It's about your political program. You're electing MPs or whatever. So if yes, do you want us to change this article? Do you want to change this?
Kennedy, do you think this referendum is going to pass, or what can you say about what the Rwandan people might do?
From the first indication, before this referendum debate started, there were close to 4 million people who petitioned Parliament, and they wanted that constitution amendment to take place. So, for example, Rwanda has about 6-point-something million voters, eligible voters. So if you find close to 4 million who are seeking the amendment of the constitution, that speaks a lot of what people in Rwanda think.
I saw an article where a member of one of the opposition parties in Rwanda, he is saying that, first of all, that the time is too short, that the people of Rwanda have not been educated about the referendum, that they need to be educated first before the referendum. Does he stand a chance, or the country is going to go ahead?
You see, this thing of changing the constitution has been going on. The debate has been going on for the last how many months? So people are aware of it. I don't know what he's talking about people not being prepared. So people know, should we amend the constitution or not? It's a question of yes or no.
It seems that President Paul Kagame and the Rwandan parliament, because there's been some opposition to this process from, say, the United States and other countries. So it seems that the president probably does, or as you said, the power derives from the people, so they are going to go ahead whether the international community likes it or not.
Yeah. The thing is, you see, I think you must understand the Rwandan side. Rwandan side, they are not pushovers in terms of being given orders and stuff like that. So what they do is that, are we following the Constitution? Yes. Does the Constitution allow for an amendment of the Constitution in 1 minute? Yes. That's the argument. If you apply the Constitution to the letter, why does someone from outside have to say anything about this? So these are the days that people who don't understand how things are done or the spirit on the ground.
Kennedy Undahiro is the executive editor of the Daily New Times newspaper of Rwanda. He was speaking with me from the capital, Kigali. Burundi and the European Union have held consultations in Europe over the growing human rights violations and political crisis in Burundi. The EU announced in October this year that it will invite the Burundian government for consultations on what it called then non-respect for the Cotonou Agreement, which governs economic and development relations between the EU and the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. Innocent Muhozi, general manager of the band Independent Renaissance Radio and Television Network, says the EU issued a communique saying that what has been going on in Burundi violates certain protocols of the Cotonou Agreement.
They say that they noticed that what is going on does not conform to the agreement of Cotonou, that there are main topics that are in the agreement of Cotonou that are not respected by the Burundian government. They noticed also the commitment of Burundian government for a dialogue and that they are waiting to see if there are going to be some actions to confirm those commitments taken by the government of Burundi during this dialogue. They say that they could just keep the actions they aid, that help straight population without going through the government. But they are waiting to see if the government will confirm his action to the agreement of Cotonou before deciding any direction to take through its cooperation with Burundian government.
Did the communique say something about the violence that's going on in Burundi? Because we noticed the violence is on the uptick.
Not specifically, because when they talk about the respect of democracy, the respect of the rule of law, the respect of good governance, that those things are not respected in Burundi, it means what it means, because this violence that is going on in Burundi can just be through those big concepts.
What did the Burundian government have to say? Did they also put out a communique, and what's their own interpretation of the meeting?
The interpretation is to say that everything went almost well, that the dialogue began. Even if they don't appreciate that in the communique, the fact that the communique of the European Union don't show the statements of the Burundian government, but that in general they repeated the commitment to confirm their actions to the general principle of rule of law, to continue the judicial actions against a certain person, but in the limits of the international standards. It's a very short communique, but globally said that they appreciate the atmosphere of the dialogue and that they don't agree with the fact that what they said was not stressed in this communique of the European Union.
In the meantime, what is happening in Burundi in terms of governance?
What is happening in Burundi is killing every day. Even today, there are several people who have been killed. There is a churchman who has been arrested. His wife was seriously wounded by policemen, and his child also. The worker was killed by the police today. There is another guy who was found in another place in Musaga dead. He's supposed to be a policeman. There are more than 30 persons who were arrested yesterday by an office of the army and another office of policemen. The families don't know where these people have been taken, and so violence is going on.
Innocent Muhozi is the general manager of the band Independent Renaissance Radio and Television Network of Burundi. He was speaking with me from Kigali in neighboring Rwanda. Today's Wednesday, December 9th, and you're listening to Daybreak Africa on the Voice of America. I'm James Butte in Washington. Please send your comments and opinions to daybreakafrica@voanews.com. Daybreak Africa time is coming up at 15 minutes past the hour. Representatives from various United Nations agencies visited refugee sites and camps for internally displaced people in the towns of Bol, Baga, and Sola in the Lake Chad area this week. The region has been severely impacted by insecurity from Boko Haram-linked attacks. Mary Allen McGrawty, the World Food Programme's country director for Chad, tells Ricky Schreier that the violence often carried out in marketplaces is increasing food insecurity for those already in need.
We visited some of the internally displaced sites and the refugee camp. We were currently looking at an increased figure of internally displaced people as people flee the islands in Lake Chad for security on the mainland. We currently have a number of over 90,000. This could possibly increase following the weekend. These are just ordinary people who are living their lives on the islands, fishing and farming, had to flee and leave everything behind, and now are totally dependent on the international community and the humanitarian sector in Chad. From a WFP perspective, we're providing food and nutrition assistance. In November, we reached over 68,000 people across 19 different sites. In December, we're looking at a further increase in that number across the UN system with the NGOs is providing also shelter and water and sanitation and basic health services. The environment out there is pretty harsh. There's limited infrastructure.
Recently, traders in Baga said that right now, on a good day, maybe 5 truckloads of fish are transported out of the town, whereas before, maybe 100 trucks a day would carry fish from the market out into the communities.
For those people who have been displaced, they're severely food insecure. About 10-12% of the population may have lost their livelihoods completely. The wider impact on the host community and that we're dependent also on the markets and also, of course, those, that traded through the markets. Of course, you mentioned, the fish, yes, severely impacted. And, of course, the trade in animals as well has been severely impacted. The circle of disruption is widening. It's not just those who are on the front lines of the insecurity. The attacks on the market as well start to remove the confidence, disturb the trade as well.
Well, you mentioned the market attacks, and I think people think of that as something that increases insecurity from violence, but also, does that affect food security? Are people afraid to go to the markets to buy food?
It'll affect, the flows through the market. The markets we saw wouldn't have the same crowd because people assembling in large numbers, unfortunately, seem to be the target. So it does generate fear.
It's multifaceted what's threatening food security in the region. It's attacks from Boko Haram-linked groups on markets. It's also people having to flee because of these attacks, correct? But fishermen not being able to access the places where they would fish. Is that correct?
It's multifaceted, multi-layer impact. The people directly fleeing insecurity, their livelihoods disrupted. Then also the wider impact we've seen with the border closures is the whole market, cross-border market trade disrupted.
That was Mary Ellen McGrawty, the World Food Programme country director for Chad. She was speaking to Ricky Stryak from N'Djamena. Protesters marched to Nigeria's National Assembly on Tuesday to denounce a bill that they say would gag social media. Viewers Chris Stein has more from Lagos.
Critics of the bill say it is an attack on free speech that goes against Nigeria's constitution. Mausi Segun researches Nigeria for Human Rights Watch.
The intention is just really to stifle and to have a chilling effect on freedom of speech.
Segun objected to provisions in the bill's text that would establish fines or jail time for people who use social media or text messages to circulate an abusive statement against institutions or individuals, as well as another provision that criminalizes the spreading of false information. Segun says existing laws on defamation and libel would make the bill redundant. The bill's sponsor, Senator Bala Ibn Nala, could not be reached for comment. The bill passed its second reading last week in Nigeria's Senate and will be sent to a committee. Social media and text messaging services like WhatsApp are popular in Nigeria both for communication and for circulating news. Prominent social media commentator Jafet Amajua says if the bill is passed, it would restrict people like him.
That law is not going to be passed, but if it gets passed, it puts you in a situation where you're mentally, subconsciously afraid to question those in authority and those in government. And were that to happen today, I definitely would not live in Nigeria. That's the truth.
The bill received a cool response from President Muhammadu Buhari, a former military dictator who cracked down on free speech in the 1980s. His spokesman, Garba Shehu, issued a statement saying the president won't assent to any legislation that may be inconsistent with the Constitution of Nigeria. That statement was published on Facebook. Chris Stein for VOA News, Lagos.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met recently with the heads of state of more than 50 African countries to discuss ways to improve the continent's health infrastructure. The talks also focused on extending the reach of India's lucrative generic drug industry into Africa, where the need for low-cost medications is great. Views Jessica Burma reports.
Developing countries in Africa are battling a host of deadly infectious diseases, from diarrheal conditions to malaria to HIV. Most low-cost generic antiretroviral drugs to treat HIV have come from India. India's drug industry, which has become the world's leader in the manufacture and export of generic drugs, could fill the need for drugs for other conditions as well. The drugs cost a fraction of the originals. Exports have reaped $15 billion for the Indian economy by some estimates. But inspectors have identified factories that produce substandard drugs that are dangerous, either because they contain toxic ingredients or simply do not work. Health economist Roger Bate is with the American Enterprise Institute, a Washington-based research organization. Fake malaria drugs have already made it to Africa, and Bate worries that more copycat drugs could be on the way.
India seems to segment its markets. It sends, on average, the better quality medicines to richer countries like the U.S., and the medicines that don't pass quality control, it sends to poorer nations, particularly those in Africa.
Global health consultant Gorvaga Nayar confirms that poorly made and counterfeit drugs are being exported to poorer countries. Nayar says she's visited some of the sham factories, but she says knowing about the problem and doing something about it are two different things.
You can see that there's children in the market buying this counterfeit product, taking it and dying, and that's actually what inspired me to work on the problem. But it's how do you translate that into policy and action that we can actually fix it? And that's where I think this entire engine is stuck.
Nayar says samples of drugs that have made it to market have been tested for purity and effectiveness, but she says tracing bad drugs back to the source can be extremely difficult. Most generics do what they're supposed to do, and countries that import them do not want to harm anyone. But Bates says health officials in poorer nations face a dilemma.
You know, the immediate response of anyone taking the drugs is horror at that kind of, a position, because they'll say, surely you should just boycott the product. The reality is that it's very difficult to do that because you end up with significant shortages.
For their part, experts say countries in Africa are also interested in getting into the business of manufacturing generic drugs, both as a way to boost their economies and get life-saving medications to their people. Jessica Berman, VOA News, Washington.
As the United Nations Climate Summit continues in its second and final week in Paris, World Health Organization officials are calling for a strong agreement to curb global emissions. As viewers Roseanne's Kerbal reports, the accord could help avert millions of deaths linked with pollution and disease in a warmer world.
Health has always been central to global climate talks, dating back to 1992, when nations first got together to discuss the problem. In Paris, negotiators are aiming to keep emissions at less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. Holding temperatures at those levels is what scientists say it will take to avoid the most dramatic impacts of climate change. World Health Organization senior scientist Darmot Campbell-Lendrum says what's good for the planet is good for your health.
And the reason that we are so concerned about the effects of climate change on health are that many of the largest disease problems that we face are highly sensitive to climate conditions. These include diseases such as malaria, such as undernutrition, and such as waterborne disease, diarrhea and other waterborne diseases.
A warmer and wetter world threatens to make these problems worse. That's exactly what's happening with dengue fever, a mosquito-borne viral infection that's put almost half of the world's population at risk. Erwin Saucedo is a local health director in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. He says the extended rainy season in 2009 had workers scrambling to control the epidemic.
La proyección de los 30,000
We think the 30,000 reported cases could easily be double that, he says, getting to more than 50 to 60,000 because of unreported cases where people have done self-treatment. Dengue fever remains a leading cause of hospitalization in Latin America and Asia. But vector-borne diseases are growing in the United States as well, with ticks transmitting Lyme disease to some 300,000 people a year. Becky Jacobs was diagnosed with Lyme disease last year, but went untreated for almost 2 decades.
I used to be very active, and then for the last 18 years, I really wasn't. Nobody could figure out, what was wrong.
17 U.S. states are at high risk for this tick-borne disease.
Obviously, the numbers show that it's a huge, huge, huge problem.
Campbell Lendrum says clean air and water are basic human rights. He says decision makers must consider the compounded health risks of a warmer world. Roseanne Skirbel, VOA News, Washington.
It's time now for Daybreak Africa Sports. Here is Mark Ouma in Johannesburg, South Africa. Very good Wednesday morning to you, Mark.
Good morning, James. In our Daybreak Africa Sports News, we focus on football. Hosts Senegal play Nigeria, then Algeria tackle South Africa in semi-final action at the Under-23 Africa Cup of Nations in Dakar today, Wednesday. Winners of these matches automatically qualify for the men's football event at the 2016 Rio de Janeiro Olympics in Brazil. In Japan, the Democratic Republic of Congo's Orange Africa Champions League title holders TP Mazembe get to know their opponents at the FIFA Club World Cup in Japan today, Wednesday. Japan's Sanfrecce Hiroshima engage New Zealand's Auckland City in Yokohama. In Switzerland, suspended FIFA Vice President Michel Platini appeared in person to plead his case before the Court of Arbitration in Sports, CAS, in Lausanne on Tuesday. This is probably Platini's last chance of getting the 90-day suspension from all football activities imposed by FIFA lifted in the hope that he can revive his FIFA presidential election campaign. The FIFA presidential elections are on the 26th of February next year. The Court of Arbitration in Sports is sports world's highest appeal court. They are expected to announce their verdict regarding the appeals by Platini and Liberia Football Federation President Musa Bility on Friday. Like Platini, Bility lodged an appeal with CAS after FIFA declined to clear him to contest the FIFA presidential elections. Meanwhile, suspended FIFA President Sepp Blatter is under investigation for any possible role in a bribe scandal of $100 million. Blatter appears to have been implicated by his Brazilian predecessor, João of Havelange, the United States Department of Justice revealed in Washington, D.C. on Monday. According to a document in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's possession, Havelange admits Blatter had the full knowledge of all activities related to bribing officials with a total of $100 million by the defunct sports marketing company ISL. And that's it for Daybreak Africa Sports News. I'm Mark Ouma in Johannesburg, South Africa. Back to you, James, in Washington.
Thank you, Mark. Have a good day. And that's it for this Wednesday, December 9th edition of Daybreak Africa. Join us again tomorrow for more Africa news and features right here on the English to Africa service of the Voice of America. On behalf of the Daybreak Africa crew, producer Nicole Beckford, reporters Peter Clotty and Ricky Stryak, as well as post editor Mark Oman, along with our engineer Charles Hall. I'm James Butter saying, have a lovely day, Africa.
Next time on Straight Talk Africa, democracy wins. With a smooth transition of power in Burkina Faso, President-elect Roch Marc Christian Kabore soundly defeated the opposition in the first free and competitive vote since independence. Tune in to Straight Talk Africa next Wednesday at 18:30 UTC when host Shaka Sali and his guests discuss Burkina Faso's future under the new leadership of Kabore.
VOA News.
When news breaks, VOA News is there. Around the clock, listen to VOA Newscast at the top of each hour, along with our detailed news programs and analysis.
We are online at voanews.com.
VOA, your trusted source of news and information.